All right, I'm here with Dario Amodei, the CEO and co-founder of Anthropic. Dario, how's it going?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being an awesome early partner as we build Cody, Source Graph's kind of first foray into the intersection of developer tools and large language models. Very excited to chat with you as you and your company have been at the forefront of spearheading and pushing the frontier of artificial intelligence. First thing I wanted to ask is to tell us a little bit about your backstory. So what was kind of the background behind founding Anthropic, and what was your motivation in starting this company?
Yeah, so we were, before Anthropic, I and many of my co-founders were at OpenAI for 5 years. We built the safety team there and also built GPT-2 and GPT-3. And yeah, we basically had a vision of, a combination of kind of scaling these models and making them safe, both in the short term and in the and in the long term. And we really see kind of empirical work on how to make the models more safe and more steerable as
Mhm.
kind of essential to that. And in the long run, it helps us to get into kind of a better place in terms of AI and broader society. And I think in the short run, it has a number of practically helpful features that make the models more usable.
Yeah, I think that was for many years a big complaint about some of the neural network based models, that they were difficult to understand and analyze when they screwed up. It was hard to kind of introspect and debug. And as you kind of look at it on the competitive landscape that's emerging now, do you see this as kind of like a continuing source of differentiation for Anthropic? Like, is that still part of your core value proposition? Like more
Yeah,
safe, more
yeah.
steerable?
I think there's kind of always something new and always a better way to do it and always new problems. So I think if I think about where the field is going, like I think the field has made I think a fair amount of progress on like what we call harmlessness, which is making sure that models don't assist in violent activities or say various things that are bad.
Right.
I think models still struggle with making things up, with the problem that's been called hallucinations, and
Yep.
also just making the process of getting these models to do what people want them to do. There's always something new, right? So 3 months ago we came out with this thing called constitutional AI. And so the idea is constitutional AI, you can make a 1 or 2 page document, we kind of called it a constitution, where you
Hmm.
list some kind of principles or values that the AI system will follow, and then you can train a model to follow that particular constitution. So different applications like a developer tool versus a legal use case versus a customer service use case, they
Yeah.
all kind of require different model behaviors, just as human professionals in those positions have kind of different need for knowledge and different expectations around how they do their job. So
Yep.
on top of the existing methods, that's like a new way to interact with systems. And so we're always trying to refine those and to develop new ones, and get to a point where the models are more reliable, more safe, do more what humans want them to do. And so it's kind of a continuing problem, and one that has to keep up with the models getting more powerful and having broader scope.
Makes total sense. I think, taking a step back a bit, one of the things that has been difficult for many folks, including myself, to kind of grasp is like how exactly these models work underneath the hood in the first place. I mean, there's kind of a range of interpretation. On the one end of the spectrum, people are like, oh, this is the precursor to AGI, or it's like almost sentient.
Yeah.
And on the other and it's, people are saying like, oh, it's just glorified autocomplete or text completion. What is your kind of like explain it like I'm five for like what language models are doing?
Yeah, so the explain it like I'm five is we still have very little idea. We're starting to get better at it, and indeed, one of the areas that Anthropic has put the most effort into is an area called interpretability, where we literally try and look inside the matrices, the weights of the model,
Hmm.
and understand what they're doing. Do they form these various circuits? But it's very early in that, right? We've identified some principles, but all of this is it's very far from being able to be applied to a to a to today's deployed models, let alone ones that are further out. So this is
Yeah.
a very active area of research for us, but in many ways we kind of don't we still don't know what's going on inside them, and that's been that's been one of our concerns, and is a separate direction from kind of trying to steer and direct the models, is trying to understand what's going on inside them. So I think, those two dual problems have been, two that Anthropic's working on. The first, I think, has direct applications for deploying models. The second is on a substantially longer arc, but we're working to make it relevant as fast as we can.
Yeah, it makes sense. Do you foresee in the future having some sort of explainability API of sorts? Like if you're trying to reason about how a model got to the response that it created, is that something that you
Yeah,
would want to expose the
I mean,
API consumer, the end user?
that's not going to happen tomorrow. I think it might not even happen next year, but
Yeah.
I think that would be the hope, to really, and there are limits to understanding, right? Ultimately, reasoning processes are, super complicated and super implicit, but it feels like there are cases where you may be able to track down, hey, there are several different reasons a model could have given the response it did. For example, did it memorize this response? Is it relying on a stereotype? Did it reason from first principles? And
Right.
yeah, I'm optimistic about someday being able to make those kinds of determinations.
Yep.
But I emphasize that's pretty far out. Like, in terms of LLMs and applications, interpretability is behind, in the sense that, it's probably like, 2 or 3 research breakthroughs away from even having that commercial relevance. But because we think it's such an important problem, we want to get to that point as fast as we can.
Fascinating. What is your kind of evaluation of the emerging landscape of language models? There's Anthropic, there's a couple of kind of proprietary players in the space. You got OpenAI, Cohere, Google is getting into the game now. Facebook is releasing open source models. There's also open source models coming out on Hugging Face. What is kind of your maybe like 10,000-foot overview of what the landscape is going to look like, and where is Anthropic going to fit into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the efforts to produce these models and deploy them in the world are moving incredibly fast, right? We've seen that in the last 3 months, and frankly, over the last 2 years, I was kind of surprised at how slow things were moving, or kind of appeared to be moving. After GPT-3, I was like, look, these things are just going to continue scaling up. They're going to get better. There's going to be a crazy explosion.
Yeah.
And the actual thing that happened was really weird. It was kind of like, there was not too much that happened for I don't know, like 2021 and 2022, and then in the last 3 months, there's this giant explosion. It feels like we've had that exponential was there in the background, but the last 2 years of exponential have all been caught, like a video that's been poorly buffered. It's all caught up in the last 3 months.
Yep.
So I think things are going pretty fast, and one hope I would have is, kind of races can happen in different ways. And something I would hope for is that, instead of, one worry here is we have a race to the bottom where everyone's kind of trying to release these as fast as possible without thinking about the consequences. But it would be great to have, and I think we're starting to see some signs of it, a race to the top where folks are, trying to make these models safer, steerable, more reliable, to characterize them better. And so Anthropic, in terms of its position in the ecosystem, often thinks of itself as a player that's kind of basically trying to push things in that direction, right? Trying to push folks to compete, to be more responsible, rather than to compete to be less responsible. And I think ultimately, that's good for the users of the model, and in the long run, that's good for humanity. So that I don't know, that's kind of our perspective on this. I mean, I think, at the end of the day, the technologies, while complex, there's no rocket science to building them. And so I think they are going to be everywhere.
Awesome. What do you think the implications are for information retrieval? Or, to put it, more bluntly, are search engines dead in the age of AI?
Yeah, I mean, I feel one thing I've realized, I've been a researcher most of my life and have only, run a company for the last couple of years. And one of the things I've realized is, technical things like if I train a language model, twice as big and for twice as many tokens, it's very predictable, what capabilities will come out of that. But when you say, like, how will consumers interact with these things? How will businesses interact? Is X business dead? Is it going to be replaced by Y? I find that second class of things very hard to predict.
Mhm.
I'm not sure I've ever met anyone who's that good at predicting them, because there's some inherent uncertainty to them. I mean, if we look at, being in Sydney, and what Google is trying to do with search, and there are several search startups we work with. We work with DuckDuckGo, for instance, that
Yep.
they're trying a different way of adding language models to their search than Bing is. I don't know what Google is ultimately going to do, but several
Yeah.
different approaches are going to be tried. And so my guess would be search isn't dead, but it's the shape of it is changing in some way that's hard to anticipate. And we're going to have a few different experiments, and some of them are going to work out better than others. And kind of the system, the economy will kind of work out what actually works and what doesn't.
Makes total sense. To kind of like dive into the technical weeds just a little bit here. So thus far, it seems to me that like the dominant model of combining search and language models is to use this kind of embeddings based retrieval, and then to take the relevant snippets and kind of like put those into the context window of the model, and then ask for the most relevant result, or for the language model to produce an answer based on the context. I've also seen papers where people are, first of all, finding ways to expand the context window, scale attention past the kind of quadratic limitation that, naive attention has. And, there's kind of like the retro-based models too that, supposedly have an effective context window of millions of tokens. Do you think that like the dominant model of the current model of using embeddings, nearest neighbor search, and fetching that in the context window will remain a thing? Or do you think it's going to evolve towards more of these like integrated approaches where we're relying on the attention mechanism or the model itself to do the information fetching?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's all kind of, in a way, it's all a little bit on the same spectrum, where they're all versions of the idea where, okay, I have my model, it's been trained on general knowledge, and then I have a bunch of additional information that I
Mm-hmm.
want to incorporate. And it kind of goes from, the simplest ways to incorporate that information to ways to incorporate that information that rely on the intelligence of the language model. And there's like a spectrum between that. On one end, it's just like, yeah, just do a nearest neighbor search, or just use Google or an internal search tool to dig up some documents, and then the model can also search over that document. And in a way, that's like a different version of like prompting your model.
Yeah.
Um, Embeddings are kind of like a way to kind of like do nearest neighbor search on something that uses the intelligence of the model on the input, but doesn't think about the specific situation. And then you could imagine, as you mentioned, with this retro paper, which is a way of using
Yeah.
the model to directly retrieve a more integrated way to do the same thing. So again, I feel like all of these are going to be tried, and I think ultimately it'll come down to how much better are the more sophisticated ones than the simpler ones.
Right.
And what do you pay for them? How much does it cost in inference? How much of a pain is it to serve? And of course, bringing it back to Sourcegraph, in the case of you guys, in terms of making code tools and developer tools, right? This is a very germane question for you guys, right? Where you have a repo, or you just may want to search over some larger set of
Totally.
some larger set of code bases and so I think you guys are going to be at the forefront of kind of experimenting with what works best in this area.
Yeah. So up until now, I think most of the language model providers have been offering kind of language models as like foundational building blocks. Like they're a piece of, that you can depend on. The language model is kind of like self-contained, and some other system can invoke it as like a subcomponent. But there's also been a lot of discussion about having language models be orchestrators of these other systems. Having these
Yes.
kind of like different information sources or context sources that the language model can call out to. Do you think that in the next 12 months, we will see like a large model provider release an API that actually does more of that orchestration, where it's not just, Sourcegraph calling out to Claude, but maybe Claude can now, do searches in Sourcegraph to answer a user query as well?
Yeah, I mean, if you take a like a very broad view of this, like one way you can think of language models is they're a little bit like the unaided human brain, or maybe even like a disembodied brain, right? Where
Yeah.
um you can teach, you train them and they start to get good at like writing code, but they've never actually interacted with an interpreter. They're
Hmm.
good at adding, at like doing arithmetic, but they're not that good. Just like a human, if you ask them to add 7-digit numbers. They don't necessarily always get right.
Yeah.
But of course, there are these tools called calculators that would enable you to always get it right. And if you ask them to reserve a restaurant for you, well, they can't actually do that because they're not connected to the internet. But they know what website to go to, and they know that they know what they would do on OpenTable if you ask them to reserve it, and what restaurants to search for. And
Yep.
so it almost feels like they're kind of like a brain looking for a body, right? And so I definitely think we're going to add all of these external tools, and the models will kind of glom onto those tools fairly easily and learn and learn to use them. So I would expect that to be something very substantial that's done. One thing I want to call out is, I said before that safety problems aren't solved, right? There's still more
Right.
differentiation in this area. So once you start to use external tools, I feel like that brings up a new set of safety issues, because the models are then taking actions on your behalf and changing the
Yes.
world in ways that you may not observe, on
Yes.
your operating system, on the web, taking action that gets felt on some other continent. And so we need to make sure that the models do what you want them to do, but aren't taking some bad or unaccountable action on your behalf. So I think that's all to say. I think this is definitely going to happen, but brings a new set of safety issues to worry about.
Yeah, that makes total sense. The prompt injection stakes become much higher when these models can actually impact the world and have mutation capabilities. So as far as developer tools are concerned, we're seeing like all sorts of companies pop up right now that are making use of language models in really interesting ways. What are the ones that you're most excited about, and what do you want for yourself or your own team? Like, what do you think will
Yeah.
amplify the productivity of your own development team the most?
Yeah. So I guess what you mean is like tools for writing code, right? Like what Sourcecraft does, and
Writing code or
what
reading
Copilot
code?
does, writing
Yep.
code, reading code. I mean, I just think there's kind of so much in this area, right? Where just a year or two we were in the autocomplete world of that was the main Codex, that was the main tool that
Yep.
was available, but that models are able to conversationally discuss code. I feel like that opens up so many possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
Feels like there's so many things, like you can have a model explain code to you. Again, we have to get the reliability up. If it's right 80% of the time, it's probably not worth it. But increasingly getting the reliability up there, explaining code, summarizing code, finding bugs in code, translating code from one language to another. I think there's a huge amount of overhang here, and I also think that this is an area where progress will be fast. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it's going to be for a technical reason, which relates to training models and relates to this external tools thing that you talked about, which is
Yeah.
when you talk to your model conversationally in natural language, there's no way to know for sure whether the answer was correct or not. A human can rate it. But with
Yep.
code, there can be this loop where, at least to some extent, you can say, oh, did the model pass the unit test or not? So
Right.
all the kind of standard automated tools of like code coverage, unit tests, kind of linters, like every kind of non-AI tool that's been developed can now be combined or integrated in some way with in many different ways, right? And so there's so many combinations here that I'm super excited to see where it all goes. And again, to make the safety point, like models running code similarly to models like taking actions on the internet that have distant consequences is something we need to make sure that it's these things are secure, that they run in sandboxes, that the code that they write doesn't have vulnerabilities that we don't anticipate. So
Yeah.
that again with the theme that, like, as the models get more expansive, these new issues come up, and we'll have to hopefully we can deal with these issues before we deploy the new generation of models.
Makes total sense. What do you think language models do to the value of data, and specifically proprietary data? I've seen a lot of commentary
Yeah.
about how companies should be building up, like every company should be building up like a proprietary data set right now, because data becomes more valuable, and we're going to see the open source data quickly be assimilated into all the language models that are available. Do you think it's important for companies to think about the proprietary data that they have access to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a super complicated question that kind of varies a lot, right? Like lots of lots of things that are available, lots of things that you might consider proprietary data in a lot of cases, might just be available on the open web. But I think
Right.
in other cases there is something, there are actual pieces of information that you can get proprietary data that you couldn't get anywhere else. So I guess I would think about it from a very human lens, right? People talk about how much data can we get to train our models. Well, we might run out at some point, but there's a whole bunch of open data. And so in
Hmm.
terms of the value of proprietary data, I think about like knowledge that's specific to the situation and
Hmm.
knowledge that isn't available anywhere else.
Yep.
And I think those are the two things that are going to have value. I think one way that quite call it proprietary data, but like it relates back to this thing you talked about with like embeddings and retro style models,
Yeah.
which is that if I ask a model like Claude a question, it has a lot of general knowledge, but it would be great if I could ask the model a question like I would ask a coworker, and both me and the coworker have a lot of information about the organization that we work at and the specific situation that we're in. So a
Yep.
lot of internal data that companies have could be used to could be used to deploy models that are specific to the internal data. And again, you can imagine this applying to SourceGraph and its customers. So that
Yep.
would be use for just one particular company. But I think there's so much around making the model custom and specific and knowing the situation, because I think more than models getting smarter, that actually might be missing more, like context and awareness of the situation.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Last question. Can I get you to opine on what the future roadmap looks like for Claude and Anthropic? We're coming on the heels of a very big week in AI. Last week with the release of GPT-4 and a lot of other interesting models. Is Anthropic coming out with new models? Are you going to go the multimodal path? Are you going to have larger context windows? What's kind of the path forward for you over the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, I think we have a number of kind of directions in terms of at some point we're gonna release a Claude 2, and again we're continuing to train the models, certainly to keep scaling them, but I think more than that, especially to focus on this like helpful, honest, harmless stuff.
Yep.
I still feel like getting the trade-off right, where the models do the things people want them to do. They don't do bad things, but at the same time, they don't kind of refuse to do things that are just fine in kind of a silly way.
Yeah.
Making sure that the models can really be relied on not to make things up. I think that is super important in a number of contexts. Like I think certain kinds of customers and companies are extremely freaked out with good reason by the idea that the model would just make something up. I mean, imagine again, like I would use like a medical or a legal setting for this. Like,
Yeah.
if it's like, okay, my doctor, they're just, they'll give you a diagnosis, but 20% of the time they just make something up. That's just
Yep.
not obviously not acceptable.
Yep.
So I think working on the honest and the helpful, honest, harmless is a big priority. In terms of kind of these other auxiliary tools, I mean, our roadmap there is very much driven by where are kind of the interesting safety problems, as I alluded to a couple times before. It's new capabilities bring new issues, and so it's almost like our where we choose to build the new capabilities determined by where we think there's a safety problem that's interesting enough that it's not trivial, but that we also think we can solve in time to deploy the model.
Makes sense.
So in this way, we're very driven by the safety issues, both because we think they're the most important, and practically speaking, they're blockers to adoption as well.
Makes total sense. Dario, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us today. And thank you for being such a great partner.